Professor Klaxon Vorthak adjusted his ceremonial lecture robes and gazed down at his audience with all four of his eyes, each one expressing a different shade of intellectual superiority. The lecture hall at Galactic University's xenobiology department buzzed with the quiet chatter of students from 17 different species, though most seemed more interested in their holographic tablets than his presentation. "Attention, please," Klaxon announced, his voice carrying that particular tone that academics across the galaxy had perfected over millennia. The tone that said, "I know things you couldn't possibly comprehend, and I'm about to prove it." Today we examine one of the most fascinating examples of primitive cognitive development in the known universe. The human species and their, shall we say, charmingly simplistic approach to narrative construction. A Zephyrian student in the third row made what could charitably be called a snort, if Zephyrians had noses. They didn't, but the sentiment was clear. Klaxon activated his holographic display, showing images of humans engaged in various activities. Mostly they appeared to be running away from explosions, which was statistically accurate for the sample footage he'd obtained. "Observe the remarkable predictability of human storytelling," he continued, warming to his favorite subject. "These creatures, despite their claims of creativity and imagination, follow the same narrative patterns with religious devotion. And the underdog protagonist, the impossible odds, the last-minute salvation through either luck, friendship, or what they laughably term human spirit." Several students perked up at this. The crystalline delegate from Theta Prime raised a translucent appendage. "Professor, surely you're not suggesting that an entire species lacks creative diversity?" "Oh, my dear student, I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as scientific fact." Klaxon's smugness could have powered a small space station. Human stories are so formulaic that we've been able to predict their narrative outcomes with 97.4% accuracy. They have heroes who always triumph against overwhelming odds, villains who monologue extensively about their plans, and something they call plot armor that ensures their protagonist survives situations that would logically result in immediate death. The professor clicked to his next slide, showing a complex flowchart that looked like someone had sneezed on a circuit board. Notice how every human narrative follows this precise pattern. Establishment of ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal of the call, meeting the mentor, crossing the threshold, and so forth. It's almost as if they've collectively agreed to tell the same story over and over again, merely changing the window dressing. A student from the gaseous nebula collective somehow managed to sound skeptical despite not having vocal cords. "But Professor Vorthak, doesn't the persistence of these patterns suggest they might serve some deeper purpose?" Klaxon's laugh was the sound of a deflating balloon trying to maintain its dignity. "My naive young scholar, the persistence of these patterns merely demonstrates the limitations of human imagination. They're trapped in their own cognitive loops, unable to conceive of truly original narratives. It's quite sad, really." He gestured grandly at his display, which now showed statistics and graphs that proved absolutely nothing but looked very impressive. "We must remember that humans are a remarkably young species. They've barely crawled out of their primordial soup, speaking cosmically. Their brains are still wired for tribal survival narratives. Good versus evil. US versus them. The lone hero saving the day. It's all very primitive when you think about it." What Professor Klaxon didn't know, as he basked in the warm glow of his own intellectual superiority, was that his lecture was being broadcast throughout the entire research facility, including to the holding cells in sub-level 7, where two particular humans were listening with growing irritation and a dangerous glint in their eyes. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, isn't it? 3 levels below Professor Klaxon's lecture hall, Captain Jake Morrison was doing his best impression of a caged tiger. If tigers wore torn military uniforms and had that particular expression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Did he just call us narratively predictable? Jake asked the air, since talking to walls had lost its appeal somewhere around day 12 of their captivity. "Oh, he's just getting started," replied Engineer Luna Park from her position by the cell's entertainment console, which she'd been systematically reprogramming for the past week. "Listen to this guy. Apparently we're trapped in cognitive loops and can't conceive of original narratives." Their holding cell was actually quite comfortable, as alien prison cells went. The Galactic University Xenobiology Department had spared no expense in creating what they called naturalistic human habitats. It looked like someone had watched every Earth movie ever made and then designed a space that hit all the statistical averages. Generic furniture, beige walls, and enough entertainment options to keep them docile. Unfortunately for their captors, they'd failed to account for the fact that Jake had been a military engineer before becoming a space pilot. And Luna had been breaking into computer systems since she was old enough to hold a soldering iron. Primitive cognitive development, Luna muttered, her fingers dancing across a jury-rigged interface she'd constructed from spare parts and sheer spite. I'll show him primitive cognitive development. Jake paused his pacing to look over her shoulder. Please tell me you're not just hacking their entertainment system to leave bad reviews on the professor's research papers. Oh, I did that 3 days ago. His academic rating is now roughly equivalent to a moldy sandwich. Luna's grin was the kind that made smart people nervous. No, I'm into their facility management system now. Did you know they use the same security protocols for their research labs as they do for their cafeteria inventory? That seems like poor planning on their part. Catastrophically poor planning. Also, Jake, you're going to love this. Want to know what they've classified our threat level as? Jake raised an eyebrow, which was impressive since he only had 2 and 1 was currently covered by what used to be a bandage. Minimal, with a subcategory of suitable for undergraduate observation. Apparently we're too predictable to be dangerous. The sound Jake made was somewhere between a laugh and the noise a pressure cooker makes right before it explodes. A minimal threat level. Right. I suppose they haven't read my service record. Or mine, Luna agreed cheerfully. Though to be fair, most of my best work was technically classified as impossible by people with advanced degrees in impossibility. Speaking of which, how do you feel about proving Professor Pretentious wrong in the most dramatically ironic way possible? Jake's grin matched hers, which was frankly terrifying for anyone who might have been watching. Which several someones were, actually, but they were all busy taking notes about typical human emotional responses to captivity, and missing the fact that they were witnessing the birth of what would later be classified as the Great Research Facility Incident of Stardate 2387. Luna, my friend, I thought you'd never ask. Jake settled into what had become their traditional planning position, which looked casual to observers but was actually a configuration that blocked surveillance angles. What do we know about their security protocols? Well, they're designed by people who think humans are predictable, so they're expecting us to either A, try to overpower the guards, B, dig a tunnel, or C, build some kind of explosive device. All terrible ideas that would never work. Exactly. Marie. Which is why we're going to do something so completely ridiculous that their security algorithms won't even recognize it as an escape attempt until we're halfway to the hangar bay. Luna pulled up a holographic schematic of the facility that she definitely shouldn't have had access to. See, the beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people don't bother to hide their weaknesses from you. They've got this entire facility running on automated systems because they assume their specimens are too primitive to understand advanced technology. And they never considered that some of us might have been the ones who invented half of this advanced technology in the first place. Jake, my mathematically inclined friend, I believe we're about to teach Professor Klaxon and his students a valuable lesson about the difference between predictable storytelling and predictable results. Above them, Professor Klaxon continued his lecture, blissfully unaware that he was about to become the starring character in exactly the kind of story he was mocking. The kind where the arrogant academic gets his comeuppance through a series of increasingly improbable events orchestrated by the very people he'd underestimated. But that would be getting ahead of ourselves again, wouldn't it? Section 3, the ironic twist setup. Professor Klaxon was truly hitting his stride now, gesturing with the sort of theatrical flair that only comes from years of being the smartest person in every room you enter. Now observe this fascinating pattern, he announced, bringing up a new holographic display. The human hero's journey. They follow this template so religiously that you could predict the entire plot of any of their stories just by identifying which stage they're currently experiencing. 3 levels below, Luna snorted as she finished her final preparations. Hero's journey, huh? Well, Professor, let's see how you like being the mentor figure in this particular narrative. Jake was busy with his own preparations, which involved a remarkable combination of spare electronics, cleaning supplies, and what appeared to be a small gravitational field generator that definitely shouldn't have been accessible to prisoners. You know what the funny thing is? He's not wrong about the hero's journey structure. The thing is, it works because it's based on how actual heroic situations tend to unfold. You mean like when overconfident academics capture people who are significantly more dangerous than they appear? Exactly like that. Meanwhile, above them, Klaxon continued his dissertation on human predictability. Note how they always begin with what they call the ordinary world. The hero starts in a state of relative normalcy before being thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Of course, being humans, their definition of ordinary usually involves a shocking amount of violence and property damage. Several students laughed at this, which encouraged Klaxon to elaborate further. Then comes the call to adventure, where the hero is presented with a problem or challenge that disrupts their ordinary world. Naturally, being humans, they typically respond to this call with what can only be described as aggressive enthusiasm. In their cell, Jake and Luna exchanged glances. Aggressive enthusiasm? Luna repeated thoughtfully. I like that. It has a nice ring to it. Much better than catastrophic security breach, which is what the incident report is going to call it. Klaxon, still completely oblivious to the dramatic irony unfolding beneath his feet, clicked to his next slide. Following the call to adventure, we inevitably encounter the refusal of the call, where the hero hesitates before accepting their destiny. This typically lasts exactly long enough for the audience to think the hero might not act, before they inevitably do exactly what any reasonable person would expect them to do. Well, Jake said, making final adjustments to his improvised device, I think we can safely skip the refusal part. Agreed. I was never one for hesitation anyway. Above them, the professor was warming to his theme. The next stage involves meeting the mentor, where the hero encounters a wise figure who provides guidance and magical tools for the journey ahead. In human stories, this mentor figure often makes cryptic statements that will only make sense in retrospect, usually right before dying dramatically to provide motivation for the hero. Luna paused in her work. You know, Jake, technically speaking, the professor is about to become our mentor figure. He's certainly going to provide us with guidance, even if it's unintentional. And he's definitely going to regret it, which is close enough to dying dramatically for narrative purposes. Klaxon continued, completely unaware that his lecture was serving as a real-time instruction manual for the very humans he was discussing. The crossing of the threshold represents the hero's commitment to the adventure, the point of no return where they leave their ordinary world behind and enter the realm of extraordinary challenge. As if on cue, Luna's fingers flew across her improvised control interface. Threshold crossed, she announced cheerfully as every security lock in sub-level 7 disengaged with a series of soft clicks that somehow managed to sound smug. And there's our call to adventure, Jake added, hefting his device with the satisfied expression of someone who just solved a particularly elegant engineering problem. Shall we go introduce ourselves to the professor? Oh, absolutely. I think it's time for him to meet his protagonists. What made the situation particularly delicious was that Professor Klaxon was, at that exact moment, explaining to his students how human heroes always manage to escape from seemingly impossible situations through a combination of luck, ingenuity, and what he termed narratively convenient timing. He had no idea how right he was about to be proven. Professor Klaxon had just reached the part of his lecture about dramatic irony when the first alarm started blaring. And you see, he continued, raising his voice slightly over the sound, dramatic irony occurs when the audience knows something that the characters do not. It's a primitive but effective technique that humans use to create tension and... He paused, finally registering the alarm. What is that noise? One of his students, a particularly astute crystalline from the Rigel system, was checking her communication device. Professor, it appears to be a security alert from sub-level 7. Sub-level 7? But that's where we keep the... Klaxon's 4 eyes widened in what could charitably be called dawning comprehension, and less charitably be called pants-soiling terror. Oh. Meh. At that precise moment, Luna's voice echoed through the facility's communication system, which she had hijacked with the casual efficiency of someone ordering coffee. Attention everyone, this is Engineer Luna Park speaking. We're currently experiencing what Professor Klaxon would probably classify as a classic example of human storytelling tropes in action. Please remain calm while we demonstrate the concept of aggressive enthusiasm. Jake's voice joined hers on the broadcast. Also, for those keeping track, we've just completed what the good professor described as crossing the threshold. We're now entering the tests and trials portion of our hero's journey. We apologize in advance for any inconvenience. Professor Klaxon stared at his communication device in horror. They're narrating their own escape? It appears so, Professor, his crystalline student replied with what might have been amusement. If crystallines were capable of amusement. They weren't, technically, but evolution finds a way. The facility's automated systems began announcing various security breaches in a calm, professional voice that somehow made everything sound worse. Attention. Unauthorized access detected in Laboratory 7. Attention. Gravitational field generators offline. Attention. Someone has reprogrammed the cafeteria dispensers to only serve coffee. And it's really good coffee. How are they doing this? Klaxon demanded, as if his students would somehow have answers that he didn't. Luna's voice crackled through the speakers again. Professor, since you're probably wondering how we're managing this, I should mention that you might want to revise your assessment of human technical capabilities. Also, your security system has some really interesting vulnerabilities. I've taken the liberty of documenting them in a report I'm sending to your academic review board. Through the facility, the sound of running feet and confused alien voices created a symphony of chaos. Jake's voice joined the commentary. Currently, we're in what you might call the supernatural aid phase of the hero's journey, except instead of magical weapons, we're using advanced engineering and Luna's frankly terrifying ability to convince computers to do whatever she wants. Klaxon was frantically trying to contact facility security, but his communications kept being rerouted to what appeared to be a recipe database. How are they broadcasting on the facility-wide system? Elementary systems infiltration. Luna's voice replied, apparently monitoring his communications too. Though I prefer to think of it as aggressive networking. Jake, how are we doing on the obstacles? Well, we've successfully bypassed the laser grid by recalibrating it to create a light show instead of a security barrier. Currently working on the locked blast doors by convincing them they're actually regular doors having an identity crisis. A new alarm joined the cacophony, this one announcing that several research specimens from other laboratories had somehow been released and were now roaming the corridors. The automated system helpfully added that most of them were herbivores, though a few were mildly carnivorous but probably friendly. Jake, Luna's voice asked conversationally, did you mean to release the Andromedan fluff monsters? That wasn't intentional, but I'm not disappointed about it. They seem happy to be free, and they're actually helping by confusing the security teams. Professor Klaxon watched through his classroom's windows as a pack of what looked like purple cotton balls with eyes bounced past, pursued by security guards who clearly hadn't been trained for this particular scenario. This is impossible, he muttered. Their escape shouldn't be working. They're following every predictable human narrative trope, exactly. His Zephyrian student raised what might have been an eyebrow, if Zephyrians had eyebrows. Professor, isn't that exactly your point? That human stories work because they follow effective patterns? Klaxon stared at his student with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd spent years constructing an elaborate argument against himself. Oh no, he whispered. Luna's voice echoed through the facility one more time. Professor Klaxon, we're approaching what you'd probably classify as the ordeal phase of our journey. This is where the heroes face their greatest challenge before the final victory. We thought you should know. Since you're about to become a participant rather than an observer. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a plasma torch, which was coincidentally what Jake was currently using to cut through the blast door leading to the main laboratory complex. Professor Klaxon found himself in the uniquely uncomfortable position of watching his own academic theories play out in real time, with himself cast in the role he'd never expected, the reluctant mentor who gets dragged into the adventure against his will. Professor, his crystalline student said with what was definitely amusement now. Regardless of evolutionary impossibility, I believe the humans are currently approaching your location. This is not how academic discourse is supposed to work, Klaxon muttered, frantically reviewing the facility emergency protocols on his tablet. There are supposed to be peer reviews, scholarly debates, published papers, not practical demonstrations involving actual escapes and security breaches. The blast door to his lecture hall chose that moment to open with a cheerful hiss, revealing Jake and Luna, who looked remarkably composed for people who had just staged what was arguably the most elaborate prison break in galactic academic history. Professor Klaxon, Luna said politely, as if she was introducing herself at a faculty mixer rather than in the middle of a facility-wide security crisis. We thought we should meet in person, since we're apparently the subjects of your research. Jake nodded respectfully to the assembled students. Sorry to interrupt your class. We'll try to keep this brief. We just wanted to point out that you might want to revise some of your conclusions about human predictability. Klaxon stared at them with all four eyes, his academic composure finally cracking. You've just proven my point exactly. You followed every single narrative trope I described. The impossible escape, the clever use of overlooked resources, the gradual escalation of obstacles. Well, yes, Luna agreed reasonably. But here's the thing, Professor. Those tropes work because they're based on how people actually behave when they're pushed into extraordinary circumstances. They're not arbitrary story conventions. They're patterns that emerge from real human psychology and problem-solving behavior. The reason human stories follow these patterns, Jake added, is because humans follow these patterns. We tell stories about heroes overcoming impossible odds because that's actually what humans do when faced with impossible odds. A new alarm interrupted their impromptu academic discussion. This one was significantly more urgent than the previous alerts, and it was announcing something about a critical containment failure in the quantum dynamics laboratory. One of Klaxon's students, a gaseous being from the Spiral Nebula, managed to sound worried despite lacking vocal cords. Professor, isn't that where they keep the experimental dimensional rifts? Klaxon's complexion shifted to a shade of blue that roughly translated to existential dread in his species' color vocabulary. Oh, magnificent cosmic forces preserve us. If those containment fields fail completely, they could tear a hole in space-time large enough to swallow the entire facility. Luna and Jake exchanged glances. Well, Luna said thoughtfully, this is where the story usually takes an interesting turn. The part where the heroes and the antagonist have to work together to face a greater threat, Jake asked. Exactly that part. Professor Klaxon looked back and forth between them, his academic worldview performing what could only be described as an emergency reboot. You're suggesting that we collaborate? Professor, Luna said gently, you're now officially at the part of the story where the pompous authority figure realizes that maybe, just maybe, the people he underestimated might actually know what they're doing. Another alarm joined the chorus, this one helpfully announcing that the facility's automated systems were struggling to compensate for what appeared to be localized reality distortions in the lower levels. Jake shouldered his improvised equipment. The good news is, we're really excellent at fixing impossible problems. The bad news is, we're going to need access to your facility's main control systems, and probably your quantum engineering labs. And Luna added with a grin that was somehow both reassuring and terrifying, you're going to have to trust us to do it our way, which is going to involve a lot of the same improvisation and aggressive problem-solving that you've been describing as primitive human behavior. Klaxon stared at them for a long moment, his four eyes cycling through various expressions of academic anguish. Finally, he sighed in a way that suggested his entire worldview was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable renovations. I suppose, he said slowly, this is what humans would call character development. Now you're getting it, Professor, Jake said approvingly. Welcome to the story. What followed was exactly the kind of climactic sequence that Professor Klaxon had spent his entire academic career dismissing as implausibly convenient, and yet there he was, living through every impossible minute of it. The quantum containment crisis was, as Luna cheerfully put it. Aggressively complicated. The experimental dimensional rifts were indeed threatening to tear reality apart at the seams. The facility's automated systems were having what could only be described as a mechanical nervous breakdown. And somehow the Andromedan fluff monsters had gotten into the main power distribution center and were causing electrical surges by accidentally absorbing energy conduits. This is impossible, Klaxon kept muttering as he watched Jake jury-rig a quantum field stabilizer using spare parts, alien coffee makers, and what appeared to be his own belt buckle. There are 17 different ways this improvised solution should fail catastrophically. Probably, Jake agreed, not looking up from his work. But here's the thing about impossible situations, Professor. Sometimes the only way through them is to do something impossible right back. Luna was simultaneously coordinating with the facility's panicking engineering staff, rerouting power through systems that weren't designed to handle it, and somehow managing to explain quantum field dynamics to a group of undergraduate students who had volunteered to help despite having absolutely no relevant qualifications. The beautiful thing about desperate situations, she called over the noise of alarms and reality trying to tear itself apart, is that they strip away all the reasonable objections to unreasonable solutions. Professor Klaxon found himself running between stations, coordinating efforts, and doing exactly the kind of heroic leadership that he'd dismissed as narrative convenience just hours earlier. He realized with growing horror and excitement, having the time of his life. "Professor," one of his students called out, "the quantum field is stabilizing, but we need someone to manually calibrate the dimensional resonance frequencies." "But that would require going into the containment chamber while it's active," Klaxon replied. "The radiation levels would be completely survivable for someone with your species' natural electromagnetic resistance," Luna interrupted. "Which, by the way, is probably why you ended up being the person in the right place at the right time to help solve this crisis. Almost like the universe has a sense of narrative timing." Klaxon stared at her. "You're suggesting that cosmic coincidence is actually intentional storytelling?" "I'm suggesting," Jake said, making final adjustments to his impossible device, "that maybe human stories work because the universe actually does have a sense of drama. Maybe we tell stories about heroes and redemption and last-minute saves because that's how reality actually unfolds when people step up and do the right thing." The professor looked around at his students, all of whom were working together to solve a crisis that should have been far beyond their capabilities, and felt something that might have been understanding dawn across his academic consciousness. "The patterns aren't arbitrary," he said slowly. "They're predictive, based on actual observed behavior when sentient beings are faced with extraordinary circumstances." "Now you're thinking like a human," Luna said approvingly, then paused. "I mean that as a compliment, by the way." The next few minutes were a blur of coordinated effort, improvised solutions, and the kind of dramatic timing that Klaxon had always insisted was unrealistic in human storytelling. Jake's device worked. Luna's power rerouting held. The students managed their tasks with the competence that young people always seem to discover when adults finally trust them with something important. And Professor Klaxon, standing in a radiation-flooded containment chamber manually calibrating dimensional frequencies while reality stabilized around him, finally understood what human stories had been trying to tell him all along. When the last alarm finally fell silent, and the facility's systems reported that everything was functioning normally again, Klaxon found himself sitting in his lecture hall with Jake and Luna, all of them exhausted and slightly radioactive, but undeniably triumphant. "So," Luna said conversationally, "how are you planning to revise your research conclusions?" Klaxon was quiet for a long moment, his four eyes focused on something in the distance that might have been the future or might have been the past. "I believe," he said finally, "that I owe human storytelling a significant apology. And perhaps the reason these narrative patterns persist across cultures and species is because they represent fundamental truths about courage, cooperation, and the surprising things that become possible when beings choose to act rather than merely observe." Jake nodded approvingly. "That sounds like the beginning of a much more interesting research paper. Though," Luna added with a grin, "you might want to include a footnote about the importance of not underestimating your research subjects. especially when they can hear you talking about them over the facility's communication system. Professor Klaxon managed something that might have been a laugh if 7-foot blue aliens with 4 eyes were capable of laughing. They weren't, technically, but like so many things that day, evolution found a way. I believe, he said, that this has been what humans would call a learning experience. The best kind, Jake agreed. The kind where everyone gets to go home with a better story to tell. And if that ending seemed just a little too neat, a little too perfectly timed, well, perhaps that was just how good stories were supposed to end.